afternoon. Welcome. You're watching Urban Debate this Sunday evening. So like I said earlier, Pfizer India has sought an emergency use authorization from the Drugs Controller Authority of India. At the moment, what we are looking at is the feasibility of a vaccine like Pfizer, which is an mRNA vaccine, different from the traditional antiviral vaccines that we have known so far. The firm in its application has sought two kinds of permissions. It has sought for an exemption, or rather they want that the clinical trials in India should be waived off. That is one point that is being sought permission for. And the second, of course, for sale and distribution of the Pfizer Biotech vaccine across India. Now, as far as the exemption point goes, this has never been done before. However, the Drugs Controller Authority of India does have the prerogative, does have the special powers to waive off clinical trials. So whether that can be done or not is another point. The DCGI has discretionary powers to waive localized clinical trials for a vaccine. So that's the larger issue that we are looking at, but there are a number of questions around what is the best vaccine for India, when can it be made available, and what is India's progress with its own indigenously developed vaccines. A lot of those issues are in front of us. I am now joined by an expert panel to help us understand the many different questions with regards to rollout of a COVID-19 immunization program in India. I welcome Dr. Shahid Jamil, Director of the Trivedi School of Biosciences from the Ashoka University. I also welcome Professor Sudhir Krishna from the National Center for Biological Sciences joining us this evening. Also, Dr. Anant Bhan, researcher in the Global Health Bioethics and Health Policy. Thank you, gentlemen, for giving us your time this evening. If I may begin by asking a very basic question, and I would like to put it to all three panelists actually. This is a point which is now being globally debated, and therefore I want to put that across first. The issue about mRNA vaccine, and now many of our viewers may not even actually know what that means. mRNA vaccine vis-a-vis the traditional antiviral vaccine, which is better? Which one should we be going for? Because much is being said about how the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine in particular are highly sophisticated, modern vaccine, technologically advanced, but not tried and tested. They claim the highest efficacy among all the candidates. If I can put that question first to Dr. Shahid Jamil, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I don't see a problem using a vaccine which has never been tried and tested. After all, we do look at new technologies and we do embrace new technologies. I think the question really is whether we can afford a vaccine such as the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine. Because Pfizer has said that outside the US they'll be selling this vaccine at $37 a dose. Now maybe they can have an agreement with India to sell it a little cheaper, but it will still be at least 10 times more expensive than the vaccine cost that Serum Institute, for example, has put out at about $3 a dose for government contracts. So it's more a question of affordability, in my view, rather than whether this vaccine is better or that vaccine is better. Remember the trials of all of the vaccines have been done against a placebo. They have been assessed against a placebo. They have not been assessed against each other. So it would be not right to say whether 95 is better than 90. The second point is that all this efficacy is so far by press release. This efficacy is not based on published data. So I would keep these things in mind. I don't see a problem, but I think the cost is going to be a problem.
Okay. Right. So some important points made there. And again, it's very important to understand what you said about the efficacy part. And I take your point about how this has been tested against a placebo, and much of the data that we have is not publicized data. Would you like to also comment on this, Dr. Anant Bhan, in response to what we just heard from Dr. Jamil?
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is Jamil, but I would probably add layers of complexity. One, that with the Pfizer vaccine, we don't have any local data. This is data which has been collected in other countries, and still that data set has not yet been published, as Professor Jamil
Yes.
was rightly pointing out. So to actually make regulatory inferences on that when we don't have any local data, I would have some concerns about that, because after all, it's a new platform. It might be a good platform. It might also be a safe platform, but we don't have that local data yet. So, the regulators will have to closely look at that decision based on what data they can get from the company, and how much inference they can have from that. The second thing is going to be, I think production is not happening in India, right, for the Pfizer vaccines. I don't think they have inked any agreement yet, which would make that whole logistics exercise even more complex. By itself, the cold chain requirements for the Pfizer vaccine are much more extreme than any of the other vaccines. That also adds to the cost. And given the safety
Yes.
concerns, given the cost and logistics concerns, it will be a much more difficult vaccine to implement in India. We also don't know efficacy in a controlled clinical trial versus effectiveness in field conditions, and we have wide temperature variations, for example, in India geographically, and all of that does impact how a vaccine functions. The final thing I would like to say is probably in this regard that I would also worry about cost,
Yes.
in the sense that if Pfizer wants this to be available in the private market, that does bring in an equity issue. I mean, should we be allowing COVID vaccines to be available in the private market while we are still ramping up supply for the public market? And would that mean that someone who has access to finances can jump the queue? Because we have a prioritization exercise otherwise in the government. But if I have finances and I can pay a $30 dose price even in India, then I might be able to get access to that vaccine. Whereas someone who's not as financially well off will not be able to, and they would have to wait for their
Right.
turn in the queue as per government conditions. I think that's an inequity issue, and I would worry about it from an ethics perspective.
Right. Those are real concerns, and those are the genuine concerns. And it should not happen that the vaccine becomes an exclusive preserve of those who can afford it, the rich and the influential. How do we guard against that? Now, Professor Sudhir Krishna, I want to bring you into the conversation, because all these important points have been raised: the safety concerns, the cost concerns, also the cold chain management. Now, that seems to be again the centerpiece of this entire debate, that even if we consider a vaccine like Pfizer or Moderna, how are we going to manage its storage? It's going to be extremely high maintenance for us, and that would just add up to the cost. And how is that going to be made available to the common man who may not be able to afford it, really?
Well, thanks for having me. I'm not sure that I can add new points, but I can elaborate on points that I made earlier. The first is the adenovirus is also a new technology. So when people refer to the nucleic acid vaccines as new technology, remember that the adenovirus has not been rolled out. I've said before on your show multiple times that once you use an adenovirus vector, you can never use it as a vaccine again, because you're going to raise antibodies to that. While the nucleic acid vaccines essentially will allow you to leapfrog into new technologies, and this kind of technology can be used for other platforms and other vaccines. I don't think cost. So when you say cost, I don't know what the hidden subsidies of costs are. The numbers that are thrown out to us don't really tell us what the subsidies are and who is subsidizing where, and they certainly can be looked at. I'll come to the equity issue later on, and I've dealt with that before also, and I'll tell you my perspective on the equity issue. But I think the important point right now is that we should move to what people call the fourth chain, or you have phase 3, and when you move to phase 4. There have been arguments about the adenovirus being used in the context of herd immunity, and the numbers that people are throwing around 70% and so on. I don't know where those numbers come from. There's a very important paper which came out in Science a few months ago, in the August 20th issue of Science, by Brighton, Ball, and Trapman, which essentially used a combination of mathematical modeling and classical infectious diseases to argue that you can get herd immunity in heterogeneous contexts like India at a little over 40%. And there were 4 principal arguments there. That one is that there's heterogeneity. If you age stratify, you sort of do spatial distribution, and you look at the fact that the RO is going to change from the beginning to now, you essentially have a different pandemic. So I think, and if I can deal with the equity issue, I think if you position the fact that if you have a single protein vaccine, so why nucleic? So Shahid's comment that he refers to it as press release It is true that they are press releases, but it is very logical that if you use a single protein as opposed to multiple proteins, you'd have a much more efficacious vaccine. So that doesn't surprise me at all. Which doesn't mean that you don't go through comparisons and the other issues. Now, coming to the point about herd immunity, if you have a highly efficacious vaccine, the herd immunity models automatically ramp up. So there's a strong case for looking at very efficacious vaccines. If you're going the Zydus Cadila route, which is a DNA vaccine, that's probably going to be the cheapest manufacturing route to go. The Moderna vaccine, the cold chain is somewhat okay. I mean, of course, Bharat Biotech, as I've said before, has a classical inactivated vaccine, and that should be kept in mind. The point is that if you integrate maths modeling with infectious disease specialists as part of the right now with the distribution analysis, then there's a possibility that you can actually go about this whole thing in a very scientific manner. The last point that I'd like to come up with, and this is something regarding the viral evolution, this is a good time to start sequencing and to plan sequencing strategies. Whether it's NIMAT, whether it's the NIBMG in Calcutta, they have been doing sequencing, and viral variants might emerge. You can rebuild vaccines using consensus. You can possibly rebuild vaccines using, say, a strategy like Raghavan Vardarajan, who uses temperature-sensitive approaches. So I think there's a whole innovation spectrum in the cold chain. Just to grab one last minute about the equity point, if you make the case that there's a fundamental distribution logistics per se, this is not that you're artificially creating inequity, then, and you can give a more efficacious vaccine, there is a case for using multiple strategies. We don't have to race to the bottom based on cost. But I'd like to hear what the other panelists say in response.
Right. Yes, yes. Actually, if I get you correctly, you are in fact arguing in favor of a highly efficacious vaccine. But if I may, from my limited knowledge, put this question to the other two panelists, Dr. Shahid Jamil and Dr. Bhan, how do we judge a good vaccine among the best vaccine, so to speak, among the good vaccines? For instance, the point of efficacy, along with the point of, say, the side effects, the duration of coverage, cost. There's so many factors that a country like India has to consider. Also, the storage facility. So, do you think that there would be some sort of a SWOT analysis, perhaps done on each of these candidates, and then perhaps we can zero in on what is best for us? Dr. Bhan, you first.
Sure. So, in a previous analysis, we have made the argument that for LMICs like ours, what you need is sort of a trifecta. And the trifecta is essentially safety, efficacy, and cost effectiveness. At the end of the day, this is going to be also largely a policy decision. There'll be a regulatory decision, but also uptake, at least for public health impact, will require a policy decision. And often I think those decisions should be based on essentially these three criteria among many other criteria, but I see these as the most important one. If we are sure about the safety element, if we are sure that this is a fairly efficacious vaccine, so far the data by press release seems to indicate it, but we have to yet see the final results in peer review. And finally, what's going to be the cost effectiveness? Very efficacious vaccine could have certain advantages, but if it's a very expensive vaccine, I guess, that will be something which policymakers would worry. We don't still know how much money has been earmarked for vaccination for COVID-19, and the more expensive a vaccine it is, the lesser doses obviously you can get. And we must remember that many countries have already pre-bought many doses, right? So how much do we have available given our population size in 21 or even 22 would also be something we would need to think through, because, after all, we need a certain minimum number of doses to have any impact.
Absolutely. So the population size, now that of course becomes a big challenge for us, and therefore there can be no comparison, say, with a country like UK that has given its approval for Pfizer. It's a small country with a much smaller population and far better infrastructure. Then they have the advantage of a very low temperature. Dr. Jamil, about the issue of shelf life. Now again, this is again a very common man's FAQ that how long will a vaccination program really take? Because if it's a double dose vaccine, it can extend probably for more than a year, over 2 years. And in that sense, how soon can we really dream of a COVID-free world? That's the question in everyone's mind.
Well, look at what you have on the table as of today. The first fact is, and I'm going by public reports, that the health minister has said that India would like to vaccinate 250 million people, 25 crore people, by the end of 2021. That means that India will require 500 million doses of a vaccine or multiple vaccines to
Yes.
accomplish that. We don't know how many doses of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines would be available. I do agree with Anant that neither of these companies have told us, and their stocks have actually been heavily purchased by the first world. Just to give you an example, you talked about UK. UK has a 67 million population, and they have already
Yes.
booked 325 million doses of vaccines, mainly from Moderna, Pfizer, and Oxford AstraZeneca. Uh, so, where would India get its 500 million doses? At this time, if you look at the capacity of Serum Institute, that capacity is roughly 840 million doses a year, out of which 50% is for India and 50% goes into the COVAX program. So let's say India will have possibly 400 million doses from Serum Institute. And I'm not even talking about the issues that Sudhir talked about adenoviruses. You give it once and you can't give the same adenovirus again, which I agree with. That's correct. Uh, what other options India has? Bharat Biotech
Okay.
has stated a capacity of 300 million doses annually, ramping up to 500 million doses. So India can pull from that. And finally, if somebody like Cadila chips in with another 100 million doses, India can easily come up with about 800 million doses
Yes.
annually. So I really don't think capacity is the problem for India. India has to really decide how it will prioritize who gets the vaccine first, the problem of equity that Anant talked about. But I think more importantly, India has to look at its distribution network. A vaccine like Pfizer and Moderna, I can't believe
Okay.
how we are going to deliver it to the last mile in the country. I mean, it requires ultra cold storage. So, if the vaccine comes in, whatever doses come in, it will be limited to big hospitals, corporate hospitals in big cities, which can have minus 20, minus 70 storage. It will not move out of this. That's problem one. The second problem is this is not your oral polio vaccine that can be given 2 drops on the tongue by anyone who's not trained to do so. This is a vaccine that has to be pulled out in a syringe, a needle attached to it, and injected. Now, India has a workforce to inject about 15 lakh doses per month at this time as part of our childhood immunization program. At this rate, if you want to deliver 500 million doses, it's going to take you 27 years to do that. So I think the real problem in India is to increase the
Okay.
capacity of people who are going to deliver the vaccine to the last mile. That's the real issue here.
Professor Krishna, again, two important points here. One, I want to actually, before going across to Professor Krishna, just on the issue of the dosage that has been ordered. So far, the information that we have in the last we checked, India has ordered the Oxford vaccine, 500 million doses, Novavax, 1 billion, and Gamalaya, 100 million. In our graphics also, you'll see that this is the quantum of vaccines that have been ordered so far. So, Professor Krishna, in terms of prioritizing, and you just heard the other panelists also talking about that India needs to focus on how we are going to go about the distribution network, the last mile coverage. I'm extremely concerned that, with the statements that have come which indicate that we are not going to be vaccinating the entire population, a critical mass will be identified. That's point number one. Point number two, can we have a multiple vaccine approach? Can there be not one but two, three different vaccines that will be rolled out in this country?
So first, let me contest Shahid's comment about last mile vaccine. question. I think that's the wrong approach. We should not be worrying about last mile vaccines. We should be worrying about last mile COVID infectivity. So if the vaccines at any point in the distribution system are achieving herd immunity, and if your rural dynamics are significantly different from the urban dynamics, and you've achieved the epidemic is over, then you don't need to worry about the last. So the idea that we have to have 500 million or a billion vaccine doses if we've already controlled the epidemic is a different way of thinking about it. So I think this obsession with numbers is not important. I think the obsession with achieving efficacy early on is important. If you look at the numbers in Karnataka right now, you're clearly, fingers crossed, second wave, pessimist taking into account, you're in pretty good shape on the epidemic. So what we should be looking at is the spatial distribution. What is the kind of age dynamics that we can vaccinate to achieve herd immunity? What are the social densities that we can target? Maybe relook the TIFR Jayanti Shastri study in Dharavi slums. So I think let's get this idea out of the way that we have to vaccinate everybody. That is not an exercise that we should be indulging in. Should we be thinking about multiple vaccines? The answer is absolutely yes. Equity, actually, if you keep bringing up the idea of equity with the idea that everything must be the same, that is not a correct argument. What you want are good outcomes. So alter your processes, bring in private public enterprises, bring in innovation, think differently, and you will get good outcomes. I think getting stuck on equity is the wrong argument. You can position it as an equity argument, but it's not the correct argument.
All right. I take your point. I want to put that across to the other two panelists for quick closing comments. Dr. Jamil, you go first. On this particular point about where should our exact focus be at this point? This is a very large population that we are looking at. And if you can respond to what Professor Krishna said about focusing on the efficacy and focusing on who needs it first and break the chain of transmission, that's, from my understanding, should be the top focus, isn't it?
Yeah, so no, I broadly agree with what Sudhir said. We need to, what do vaccines really are used for? To my mind, a vaccine is used for three things. One is to really achieve what we call herd immunity. The second is uh, protect mortality. So if you go by those principles, then to protect from mortality, you will have to give it to people who have comorbidities, people who are on the front line. You have to protect them. All of that. But let me also add that it's not really going to be a question of efficacy. I mean, efficacy is important, but I think coverage is also important. You can't have a 95% efficacious vaccine and have only 20% coverage. Coverage is important. So look at a vaccine which is practical to deliver in a country like India, practical to store in a country like India. And honestly, I don't think there is capacity in the country at this point to handle vaccines such as the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. But I'm not saying don't build that capacity. Go ahead and build that capacity.
Okay, quick last word to Dr. Bhan before I wrap up. Dr. Bhan, on the issue of efficacy, on the issue of coverage, where do you stand? Quick closing comments, please.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, efficacy is an important factor, but we have we have highly efficacious vaccines like rotavirus and HPV, and we haven't gotten anywhere with coverage, and we haven't gotten anywhere with impact. So, I mean, again, unless you get coverage, unless you get distribution, and while PPPs are great, public-private partnerships, our experience even during the pandemic has not been that great. So I think the equity question from my perspective certainly is still important, because at the end of the day, this is not just an urban phenomenon versus a rural phenomenon. And hopefully, Professor Krishna is absolutely right. If the government can get the modeling right and get the right experts in and use their advice to drive the response, that would be great. But we haven't seen that pan out very well either so far. So I think we are being probably too optimistic on that count. But hopefully there will be course correction and they will listen in. There's a lot we need to learn, but I think planning in advance, planning based on our prior experience with our immunization program of decades, where, remember, again, we haven't gotten the optimal coverage with vaccines we've had for decades, is an important lesson for us to plan enough and get those resources, as Professor Jamil was saying.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to the panelists, Professor Sudhir Krishna, Dr. Shahid Jamil, and Dr. Anant Bhan, for giving us your perspective. And like you said, we have to set the right model. This is a very different demography. It's a huge population. It is going to be a Herculean task, no denying. But yes, once we set the parameters, once we get the basic model right, we should succeed in vaccinating the population and, of course, getting ourselves firmly on the path of recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Thanks for joining us.